All right, so today we have a Servo tribal deck. Servos are very unique because they are artifact creatures, but there are no Servo cards other than changeling cards. Instead, they're tokens, which are created by creatures with Fabricate and a few other ones, and we'll see them later. And they're interesting because the creatures that create them are themselves not artifacts. Otherwise, servos do support a go wide kind of strategy. They have artifact synergies, creature synergies. They don't have a lot of tribal lords, so they're flexible, but obviously the synergies aren't that big. They're certainly not a strong tribe. They're more of a janky fun tribe. They actually do let us show off a few interesting cards because they do interact very interestingly with a few different effects, which oftentimes we don't see in a lot of tribal decks. So the commander we chose is Karador, the Ghost Chieftain. He's in the Abzan colors, that's black, green, white, which all the Servo token creating cards in Kaladesh and Aether Revolt are in those colors, so it's very convenient. His first ability lets him evade the commander tax, and then it's just a nice late game recursion engine, being able to recast any of our creatures, get more servos, as you'll see later on. The first part of the Servo deck obviously involves all the cards that actually lets us create Servo tokens. So I didn't play all of them. I think I cut one. And then otherwise, I played most of the cards. I mean, they're not particularly great. They're draft fodder, essentially, at the end of the day. They create the Servo tokens, and they're not like the worst. A Servo isn't really worth a card, but it's worth like half a card. And each of these lets you bring half a card while still getting a body. While they're not going to compete in the late game, in the beginning and mid game, they do grind up the board pretty nice. They put up the pretense of defense. It dissuades people from attacking you. People don't want to waste their turn swinging into a 1/1 Servo token or like a 0/1 Weaponcraft Enthusiast. Basically, they're so bad that it's not profitable for the opponent to interact with them. And then at the same time, they do generate some value in the Servo tokens, so they are quite interesting. Again, obviously, we're playing almost all of them, and we just need a critical mass of these. Mostly, these creatures don't really matter. It's mostly that we get servos, because there's no real other way for us to get servos. Near Battle Sphere, it's kind of the same thing. It's an artifact creature that creates artifact creature tokens. The fact that it's an artifact creature is very important because we're going to have both artifact and creature synergies in this deck. Aether Poisoner, which is just 2 energy, and then you get a Servo token with it by attacking with it. It has Death Touch, which is actually really useful, more so than the other 2 Aether somethings in these colors. Nobody wants to attack into a 1/1 Death Touch. Like, it's just not worth it. That's what this deck is trying to do in the beginning of the game, is to just gum up the board with these like Servo token creatures that accrue a little bit of value and otherwise gets people off our back. Angel of Invention and Cultivator of Blades are the backbone of the mid game for this deck. Angel of Invention is obviously very good because it can drop 6 power worth of creature by itself, which even in EDH, that's in Commander, that's not even the greatest, but it also pumps all of our other creatures, and the fact that it can also just be a 4/3 Flying Vigilance lifelink that also is an Anthem, like very flexible card. Cultivator of Blades is also quite good when it works. It does come with 2 tokens if we needed to, but also only really at its best when we can actually give it the +1/+1 counters, and then it's like an overrun every turn we attack, and that's really good in ideal conditions, but it almost never works out. It's just way too fragile. But it's a Fabricate creature. It does let us do a ton of damage in some situations. And these are our spells that make servos. Servo Exhibition and Saran's Expertise basically just create some number of servo tokens. It's a fair value. It's not going to break any games. Again, Saran's Expertise is pretty nice with the expertise ability. Renegade's Getaway is an interesting card. The ability to give indestructible to anything. We can protect opponent's permanent for the politics move. Ovia Pashiri Life Sage, her name is really hard to say. Ovia Pashiri Sage Lifecrafter and Master Trinketeer. They're a source of infinite number of servo tokens as long as we pay mana. Ovia is 1 CMC, which is actually important later. And Master Trinketeer is the only actual servo lord, and it makes servo tokens And he's also a 3/2 for 3 mana, which is a fine deal, although that doesn't matter in EDH. And then we have Animation Module. If we pick the +1/+1 counters on our Fabricate creatures, we can pay more mana to get another Servo. So in the late game, it just like lets us buff our creatures a little bit. And then also, if we do have a creature with a +1/+1 counter on it, we can sort of proliferate that counter every turn with the second ability and get another Servo every turn for 4 mana, which is fine. And then we have Sly Requisitioner and Hidden Stockpile, both of which allow us to get a Servo token when one of our permanents die. Sly Requisitioner is a death trigger for non-token artifacts, whereas Hidden Stockpile is a revolt trigger, so we only get it once per turn. But in either case, it seems to suggest that like a sacrifice type theme is appropriate for the Servo tokens. Along those lines, Hidden Stockpile actually is also a sack outlet for these Servo tokens, allowing us to scry. Our last Fabricate creature is Marionette Master, which is probably the best Servo creating creature. If we don't have a board presence, it's the only Fabricate 3 creature, and it can Fabricate 3 and just make 3 Servos is good. And then in addition, if we don't need that, it's a 4/6, and then it can actually dome our opponents for 4 life loss per artifact that dies. That's an insane amount of damage. It definitely adds up, and it's just a very good card. Walking Ballista, it's not a Servo obviously, but it's just in here because it does damage to our opponents. Walking Ballista is a really good card because it's so flexible. It's a mana sink in the late game. It's another blocker in the early game. It does damage, it's removal. It's just a very flexible card for any deck that cares about artifacts and creatures and +1/+1 counters. It's a good card. Mycosynth Lattice. The reason this card is being included is largely because we have a lot of artifact synergies. A lot of our Servo creating creatures are themselves not artifacts, and so the deck just runs way more smoothly if everything that we have is an artifact. So Mycosynth Lattice is a very useful card. Here we have our sacrifice outlets. We have Arcbound Ravager, it's a pretty good card in this deck. Arcbound Ravager is not very good in most decks, but Arcbound Ravager is good because in here we do have a lot of artifacts. We do synergize off +1/+1 counters a little bit. Being able to sacrifice creatures to boost its power means any of our Servos dying, we get value off of that. And then modular means if we have a lot of Servos, it's hard for our opponents to have blockers for them all. And then so when we attack, we can actually put the +1/+1 counters on whichever creature they don't block. So it makes for a lot of interesting plays, makes the combat math a bit more interesting. Horrorclan Ironworks is another sacrifice outlet. It's a very good ramp card. It turns our Servos into, mana acceleration. We can cast more things. It can even sacrifice itself, and it's just a really strong card. It's a really flexible card. It does a lot for the deck once it's out, once it gets going. Herald of Anguish. It's not really an incredible sacrifice outlet, but it is obviously. We can use it in the late game to snipe their creatures. Once we have more artifacts, once we have more mana. The key here is that it has Improvise, which means it's really easy to cast. We can tap our extra Servo tokens to help cast it. It comes out way faster than its 7 mana looks. Has flying, has a big body, and it also makes our opponent discard cards. So it's just a good value card to have for the mid to late game. For Viscera Seer as our final card, I did want an outlet that can actually sacrifice creatures instead of artifacts, because again, we do have all those Fabricate creatures which are not artifacts. The Scry is really useful, lets us help us find all these different cards that we need for things to be going. And the fact that it's 1 converted mana cost, again, is important for later. Here we have our token and synergy cards, Anointed Possession and Parallel Lives. We have a lot of Servo tokens. We just wanted twice as many Servos, overwhelm our opponents. Doubling Season, again, does the same thing. Also synergizes with our +1/+1 counters on our Fabricate creatures, on our Arcbound Ravager. And then finally, Panharmonicon allows our Fabricate creatures to fabricate twice in a row when it comes into play. More tokens, just overwhelming the board. These enchantment cards and Panharmonicon, they're very powerful, and our tokens need that help because we are running so many weak creatures otherwise. Here we have 2 more of our synergies. These creatures are really meant to boost our Fabricate creatures. Steel Overseer drops +1/+1 counters on itself, on the Servo token, any other artifact creatures we have. And Eldrazi Displacer, very straightforward. Just flicker our Fabricate creatures, they come back into play, they fabricate again, we get more tokens. We can make 1 to 3 tokens with every 3 colorless mana we have. That's a pretty good rate, so it's a powerful card here. Here we have our non-creature buffing options. So we have Tempered Steel. We have a lot of artifact creatures, and all our creatures become artifact creatures with Mycosynth Lattice, and just giving a +2/+2 boost to all our Servo tokens. It just does so much damage. It like triples the amount of damage our Servos are doing. And then here we have Cranial Plating. We have a lot of artifacts in this deck, a lot of Servo tokens. We have Mycosynth Lattice, and so Cranial Plating hits for a huge amount of damage. And because with Cranial Plating and Servo tokens, we can just use its instant move effect to put it onto any Servo token which my opponent doesn't block, and then just always hit our opponent for a ton of damage. Blade of Selves, it's a bit expensive, but it is an artifact, and it gives our attacking creatures Myriad, which means it creates an extra token copy of that creature for each opponent, and it's going to be attacking that opponent. Those tokens get exiled. But the thing is that for our Fabricate creatures, when they get exiled, the Servo tokens stay, and again, so it's just another way of getting value off of janky Fabricate creatures. Our final cards to boost our team is these 2 heavy-hitting late-game creatures, Elesh Norn Grand Cenobite and Craterhoof Behemoth. Elesh Norn gives all of our creatures +2/+2, and then it also just hits all of our opponent's creatures with -2/-2. As long as she stays in play, it's so impossible for our opponent to defeat our Servos in a straight-up fight. And then Craterhoof Behemoth, it just comes down and ends games. We have a ton of creatures in this deck. They're going to become enormous and trampling. We can regularly get +5/+5. We can get +10/+10. We can go crazy in the super late game, get +20/+20 boost to everything, and just do a ton of damage to the entire table. Here we have 2 of our spell-based reanimations. We already have Karador, but these things just supplement them. Victimize is a very strong card because we can sacrifice a Servo token that we have lying around. Doesn't cost us very much. You get back 2 creature cards. At worst, we can get back some Fabricate creatures, get a few more tokens. We can bring back Elesh Norn or Craterhoof Behemoth. Wake the Dead, again, is great. Once a lot of our Fabricate creatures have died in the late game, we can just cast this for a lot of mana, bring back a lot of creatures, get a lot of Servo tokens, block with all our Fabricate creatures, and then they die, but we still get to keep all the Servos. It's great. And then for our permanent-based recursion, we're using a lot of reanimation, graveyard recursion strategies as a way of gaining card advantage in this deck because they just work so well with these Servo tokens. With the Mimic Vat, we can imprint one of our dying Fabricate creatures, and then every turn we can make a copy, we can attack with it, we get Servo tokens. And then Eternal Witness, it's just a really strong card that brings back any card. Here we have 2 of our card drawing engines. We don't have a lot of them, unfortunately, but here we really cash in on these Servo tokens with cards. Skullclamp, obviously an incredible draw engine. Each of our Servos, we can just pay 1 to turn them into 2 cards. It's an incredible deal. Mentor of the Week, another very good card. Again, every Servo token that comes into play, we can pay an extra mana to draw a card. Not quite as busted as Skullclamp, but still a strong card. Here's our tutor package. We obviously play Demonic Tutor, the most powerful tutor in black. Diabolic Intent, another good card. In this deck, it's essentially the same as Demonic Tutor. We can just sacrifice a Servo token. We have Survival of the Fittest, which is a strong card in this deck because we have a lot of creatures all along the mana curve. So in the early game, it can turn a big creature into a cheaper Fabricate creature. In the late game, a dorky Fabricate creature can become a game-winning Craterhoof Behemoth or like Elesh Norn. So it's just a really flexible card. Birthing Pod is actually not the easiest to make work in EDH sometimes, but Birthing Pod is definitely very good here. We have a very good curve of creatures ranging from 1, that's why we had all those 1 converted mana cost creatures, all the way up to 7 and 8 with Elesh Norn and Craterhoof Behemoth. The point of Birthing Pod is not necessarily to get up to those creatures because we have a lot of ramp, but the point of the Birthing Pod is to go from 3 to 4 to 5, hitting Fabricate creatures all the way, getting more Servo tokens, and then we can turn those Servo tokens into 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, go back up. So it's just a really good way of churning through our deck, getting all these cheap creatures out of our deck, and just building a board full of Servo tokens. And we have a super light removal sweep because we're hacking our deck with those shits because we'd rather play silly draft creatures. But the card we most don't want to see is something like Torpor Orb, Humility, Hushwing Griff, the one from Ixalan. Anything that prevents enter the battlefield creature effects is just so brutal for us because that's what we rely on. And so Anguish Unmaking is here to get rid of that. And then Duplicant, I wanted a 6 convertible mana cost value creature, and Duplicant is good because it's just another good value card for exiling annoying opponent creatures, and again, sometimes you just exile something huge, it becomes a huge monster. Another useful artifact creature card for our artifact creature synergies. When it comes to ramp, again, mostly artifacts. Soul Ring, Grim Monolith, Signet, some pretty standard artifact ramp. Not too picky about which one's which. Chromatic Lantern, Thran Dynamo, some more expensive artifact ramp, as well as Solemn Simulacrum for the artifact creature synergies and just being a strong card. You know, in green you wouldn't normally play Solemn, but in this deck, because of the artifact creature synergies, I think it's worth it. And then Sakura Tribe Elder, which is not an artifact, but it's a creature. It's a 2 mana cost, which we needed another 1-up for Birthing Pod. It's just a strong green ramp card. This is our late game mana acceleration. We have Earthcraft and Inspiring Statuary. Both of these kind of do the same thing and letting out us tap our Servo tokens to help cast our spells. And this is quite strong in the late game because we hopefully have a lot of Servo tokens. They also allow us to semi-combo off. We don't have any infinite combos in the main deck here, so no Scroll Nest. We're still getting a lot of extra mana, and it lets us cast our bigger spells. When it comes to our lands, we're running 37 lands, 63 spells, which is the mix that I like for any deck that's not trying to ramp too hard or is too low to the floor. But I like all 3 on-color Dark Ascension Innistrad lands here, actually. Gavany Township, extra creatures enormous, does a huge amount of extra damage. Once in the late game, we have the mana to activate it. Grim Blackwoods, letting us sacrifice extra Servo tokens to draw a few cards, which is always useful. And then Vault of the Archangel, giving creatures Death Touch and Lifelink. Nobody wants to swing their team into a bunch of death-touching servos, so it's a great defensive card, and then Lifelink is also helpful. It's useful to always have a way to recover some life. Here's our single-colored utility lands. Bojuka Bog, it's just incidental graveyard hate, which is always useful, and Mistveil Plains, same story. Plains card, every white deck can and should be running it, and just the ability to recycle a card into the bottom of our library. You know, it's not going to come up a ton, but there's no cost to running it, and it's just useful in the late game, as EDH games sometimes go to. And then Pendelhaven, I wouldn't normally run it because, you know, there's not that many 1/1 creatures that we'd want to buff, but here with our Servo there is, and it's just like a few extra points of value. Again, there's not too much risk. Strip Mine, obviously a useful card for just nuking opposing lands. We're not going to run too many land destruction cards. We'll run one, the best one, Strip Mine. And Gaia's Cradle, obviously quite strong in a Go Y token deck, and another no-brainer for a green creature-based deck. Just a ton of mana. Too bad Earthcraft cannot untap it, but that's probably for the best. Phyrexian Tower, another card that lets us sacrifice servos, just get some more black mana, which is also very useful. Here's our three color cards: Mantower, Murmuring Bosk, and Aether Hub. No reason to play Aether Hub other than for the sake of being on theme with the servos from Kaladesh. Command Tower, 3 mana, comes in and play on tap land, very strong. Murmuring Bosk is interesting. It's a forest, can be fetched by fetch lands, does do pain land damage to us, but that's not a big deal. Playing Murmuring Bosk in Advamp because you don't see it that often. Although I guess you see it more now because it was in the Atraxa deck, so every Atraxa deck kind of plays it sometimes. We have white green lands, obviously. No, there's no extra explanation. I decided to pick pain lands as our 4th land after fetches, shock, and duels. Black ones, black green ones, and black white ones, of course. We have 4 artifact lands. They are quite vulnerable, but because we have cranial plating and all those artifact sack outlets, I think they are worth running in here. And then finally, we have our nice Kaladesh basic lands, just a spread of 3 forests, 3 plains, 3 swamps. A little bit low on the basic count, but even though we do have Earthcraft and Sakura Tribe Elder, I haven't ran into too many problems with my basics getting nuked. We can always be conscientious and make sure to fetch them with our fetch lands and things like that. So as for their sideboard, we have Bane of Progress, which is our mass artifact and enchantment destruction. This unfortunately does kill all of our servos, but we do get more +1/+1 counters on it, so that's always nice. Austere Command as well is a useful board wipe because it's so flexible. We can save all of our servos while wiping bigger creatures as well as enchantments. So those two modes are probably going to get picked the most. Again, artifacts do kill our servo tokens, so sideboard because we'd really be wanting to face a deck that goes wider than us, which is, like not impossible because we're probably around like maybe 75th percentile, 80th percentile when it comes to going wide, but could come up. And then Maelstrom Pulse again, because I really think Humility and Torpor Orb and those kinds of cards pose this deck really badly. So Maelstrom Pulse there to take care of that without relying on an ETB effect that's going to get shut down. Here are the artifact hate cards. Relic of Progenitus, which is a strong card against graveyards. Even though it does exile our own graveyard, that's not a terribly big deal because we can choose when to activate it. And then if we're not activating it, it also counts as an artifact for Inspiring Statuary, as does Thorn of Amethyst, because we don't even need to tap it for anything. It's great with Improvise, and it's for like anti-Spellslinger, anti-Storm, Defense Grid, more against counter spells, but a massive 3-mana attack, so people aren't interfering with our shenanigans. A similar set of strategies for our creature hate cards. Watchers of the Dead is another very new, very interesting graveyard hate. I do think it does enough in most cases. There are going to be situations where the fact they get to keep their 2 best graveyard cards just screws us. And the fact that it's an artifact creature does make it attractive for this particular deck. I am certainly willing to admit I'm wrong on this being even at all viable. I'm still testing it out, but I think it's not a bad card. Aethersworn Canonist, another artifact creature, again, just slows down the Spellslinger decks a little bit more. And then finally, Dragonlord Dromoka, again, just can't be countered, prevents our spells from being countered, has lifelink, flying. It's just another solid card, just sits on our side of the board and just makes it harder for our opponents to mess with our shenanigans. And then here we have Gave, Guru of Spores, which is probably the more powerful commander in abstract for our deck, but I find that Gave just combos so easily with everything. Every single deck with Gave as the commander just becomes a Gave deck. It's never whatever the theme it's supposed to be. And the problem is that it just draws way too much hate, at least in my play group, because we all know how insane this guy is once he gets going. That being said, we can still have Gave in our sideboard and bring him in if we are in a more of a combo mood or we feel like we might need to combo off faster against what we're facing. It combos well with Doubling Season, with Earthcraft. And then Butcher of Malak here, it's the Grave Pact effect on a 5/4 flying creature. It's just to make sure we can muscle through the ground war against other creature decks. And also helps us take out annoying indestructible creatures or something like that. Sadistic Hypnotist, another great value card. They just make the opponents discard so many cards. It's just very useful for disrupting strategies where they're not committing a lot to the board. And then finally, at the end of our sideboard, we have a couple of other ways of buffing our creatures. Eldrazi Monument and Avacyn Angel of Hope are more defensively oriented against more Wrath or removal heavy decks, especially Avacyn could replace perhaps Craterhoof Behemoth. And then Triumph of the Hordes, another overrun effect, but a different overrun effect, giving everybody Infect and ++1. It just kills people. It does a lot of work, and this card just pisses everyone off, but sometimes it's a good check against people gaining infinite life or some other shenanigans like that, or if we just need to end the game. So yeah, that's the Servo deck, and I think it's a really interesting tribe because it has a lot of limitations, but it also, like, everything works out well. The Fabricate works nicely. It's not like an enters the battlefield with kind of effect, it's a when it enters the battlefield effect, so it works nicely with all these different synergies. We got to see a lot of interesting artifact creature synergies that, I think we don't really see that much because the fact that the Fabricate creatures are not artifacts, but they're enter the battlefield effects, which create artifact tokens, makes for a very interesting thought experiment on how to maximize this. And this deck obviously is not very strong. It doesn't stand up well against decks with a lot of removal because it is very vulnerable. However, this deck is capable of just dropping a lot of servos, hitting Tempered Steel, and just dealing a lot of damage. The sacrifice effects with Marionette Master and just generating a ton of mana with Core Clan Ironworks is strong. And then we also have Gave in the sideboard. that we can bring in to just combo off, and Walking Ballista is our preferred win condition with infinite mana. So there you go. Servos, enjoy.